You're strapped into a P-47 Thunderbolt somewhere over occupied France, and your altimeter shows 19,000 feet, standard fighter patrol altitude. You can see everything from up here: the patchwork fields, the silvery ribbon of the Seine, the dark spots marking German airfields below. You feel secure at this height. You're mistaken, because in the summer of 1943, American fighter pilots were dying at this altitude faster than the Army Air Forces could train replacements. The statistics painted a grim picture. Between May and August 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 198 fighter aircraft over Europe. Not from engine failures, not from fuel exhaustion, from German fighters that could climb higher, maneuver tighter, and had been fighting in these skies since 1940. The Luftwaffe's Bf-109s and Fw-190s dominated the altitudes between 14,000 and 26,000 feet. They'd perfected the ambush, diving from the sun, ripping through a P-47 with 20mm cannon rounds, then climbing back to safety before the American pilot even registered what happened. Every mission briefing became a casualty forecast. Major Hub Zemke commanded the 56 Fighter Group in Halesworth, and by July 1943, he'd watched too many empty seats appear in the mess hall. The tactical approach wasn't functioning. The Army Air Forces had trained every pilot to maintain altitude superiority, to fight in the vertical dimension, to never surrender your height advantage. It was doctrine. It was also getting everyone killed. Zemke started considering the unthinkable. What if altitude was the liability, not the asset? What if the solution was down, not up? The concept sounded absurd. Flying low meant you couldn't spot threats approaching. It meant one error would plant you into French soil before you could react. It meant flying slow enough that German flak could track you. Every tactical manual stated low-level penetration was suicide for single-engine fighters. But Zemke examined those 198 lost aircraft and asked a fundamental question. Compared to what? Compared to the current survival rate, because that wasn't working either. In August 1943, Zemke quietly pulled aside 3 of his most seasoned pilots, Captain Walker Maharan, Lieutenant Robert Johnson, and Captain Gerald Johnson. He told them to forget everything they'd learned about altitude discipline. Next mission, after the bomber escort duty was complete, he wanted them to descend, not to 12,000 feet, not to 8,000, all the way down. Skim the trees, see what happens. If they got court-martialed, he'd accept the blame. The 3 pilots exchanged glances. They'd all lost wingmen in the past 6 weeks. They agreed. On August 19, 1943, those 3 P-47s plummeted from 19,000 feet to 150 feet over the French countryside. They flew so low that French farmers dove for cover. They flew fast, 360 miles per hour with their throttles pushed forward, and something unexpected occurred. They spotted a German airfield near Beauvais with Fw-190s lined up like toys. The Luftwaffe pilots never saw them coming. The P-47 screamed across the field at propeller height, guns blazing. 5 Fw-190s exploded before the German gunners even reached their flak positions. The 3 Americans pulled up, stayed low, and made it home. 0 casualties, 5 kills, and a revolution had just ignited.
Flying at treetop level wasn't just flying low. It was weaponizing physics in ways that inverted every German advantage. When you're at 100 feet, doing 360 miles per hour, the rules of aerial combat stopped making sense to everyone except the pilot doing it. The Luftwaffe had radar stations scattered across France, sophisticated Freya and Würzburg systems that could detect Allied formations 100 miles out at altitude. They'd vector Bf-109s to intercept with ample time to climb, position, and attack. But radar waves travel in straight lines, and the Earth is curved. Below 400 feet, you disappeared into what radar operators called ground clutter, the messy radar returns bouncing off hills, structures, and trees. At 100 feet, you were invisible. You became a ghost screaming across France at 5 miles per minute. The reaction time advantage was even more devastating. Picture a German pilot at a forward airfield, sitting in his FW-190, engine warming up for a morning patrol. At 19,000 feet, he'd get a 4-minute warning from radar, plenty of time to take off, gain altitude, prepare. At 100 feet, the first warning he received was the sound of Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines howling over the tree line. From sound to impact, 9 seconds. Not enough time to sprint to your aircraft, not enough time to man the flak guns, barely enough time to comprehend you were about to die. American pilots started catching German fighters on the ground with their wheels chalked, pilots still climbing into cockpits. It was slaughter, not combat. The speed differential became a survival mechanism. A P-47 at full throttle, doing 360 miles per hour at ground level, was moving too fast for German gunners trained on high-altitude tracking. Flat crews calculated lead time based on altitude and speed. Fire where the target will be, not where it is. But at hedge-hopping altitude, those calculations collapsed. By the time an 88mm shell reached where you were supposed to be, you'd already traveled a quarter mile past it. Light flak, the 20mm and 37mm guns, required visual tracking and smooth motion. You gave them neither. You were a blur that appeared and vanished before the gunner's brain could process what his eyes had witnessed. Then there was the pursuit problem. Say a Bf-109 spots you and dives to engage. He's got speed. He's got position. He's got you dead to rights. Except he doesn't, because at 100 feet, there's no room for error. Every pursuit maneuver he makes risks flying him into a hillside or a tree. You're not just evading his guns, you're forcing him to choose between killing you or killing himself. Most German pilots pulled up. They'd been trained for altitude combat where you had 10,000 feet of forgiveness below you. Nobody had trained them to dogfight at the altitude where birds live. The psychological pressure reversed. Suddenly, the hunter was terrified and the prey was comfortable. American pilots discovered they could use terrain like submarines use depth. See a German fighter? Drop into a river valley and follow the curves. The Bf-109 either loses visual contact or follows you into a maze of hills where his speed advantage becomes a liability. Spot a village? Fly straight through it using buildings as shields, church steeples, water towers, tree lines. Everything became tactical cover. The Luftwaffe had owned the sky. The Americans stole the ground and transformed it into a weapon. Physics didn't care about doctrine, and at 100 feet, physics was on America's side.
The P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't designed for this. Republic Aviation had built it as a high-altitude interceptor, a 7-ton monster meant to escort bombers at 26,000 feet, where the air was thin and turbochargers mattered. Its massive R2800 engine generated 2,000 horsepower, but all that power was optimized for climbing and performance in the stratosphere. When pilots started bringing these machines down to treetop level in late 1943, they returned with shredded belly panels, damaged oil coolers, and tales of impacts that should have killed them. Republic's engineers realized they had accidentally built the perfect low-level fighter. They just needed to finish the job. The first modification was pure survival engineering. Starting in November 1943, Republic began adding quarter-inch armor plating to the P-47's belly and lower engine cowling. This wasn't protection against bullets, it was protection against France. At 100 feet, you weren't just dodging enemy fire, you were dodging trees, power lines, and your own mistakes. Pilots were clipping branches, smashing through telephone wires, and somehow staying airborne. The belly armor meant that when, not if, you scraped a treetop, you might survive it. They added reinforced brackets around the oil cooler after 4 pilots linked home with punctured cooling systems from tree strikes. One pilot, Lieutenant Francisci Gabreski, landed at Halesworth with an 8-foot tree branch wedged in his landing gear. The armor had saved the hydraulic lines. The gun sight modification was subtler but just as critical. The standard N9 reflector gun sight was calibrated for deflection shooting at altitude, leading a target that's maneuvering in 3-dimensional space thousands of feet away. At ground level, your targets weren't maneuvering. They were stationary, parked aircraft, locomotives, fuel trucks, supply columns. You needed a sight that could acquire targets instantly in the 3 seconds you had them in view while traveling 360 miles per hour. By January 1944, Republic began installing modified K-14 gyroscopic sights with adjusted ranging, basically turning the Thunderbolt into a gun that could aim itself. You put the pipper on the target, squeezed the trigger, and 8 .50 caliber Brownings erased whatever you were looking at. They changed the wing racks too. The P-47 could carry bombs, but the standard shackles were designed for high-altitude release. Drop a 500-pounder at 100 feet and the blast would kill you as efficiently as it killed the target. Engineers developed low-altitude skip bombing techniques, borrowed from the Pacific Theater. You'd approach a bridge or bunker at maximum speed, release at the last possible second, and let the bomb skip like a stone across water, except it was skipping across concrete straight into a German fuel depot. The P-47 D-26 variant that rolled out in February 1944 came with reinforced wing roots specifically to handle the stress of pulling out of these insane attack runs. But the most important modification wasn't mechanical. It was tactical training. By March 1944, replacement pilots arriving in England were going through a new qualification course at Atcham. They'd fly navigation runs at 100 feet across the English countryside, learning to read terrain at speeds where hesitation meant death. They'd practice snap firing at ground targets, learning to shoot in 1-second windows. They'd fly formation at hedge height until flying that low felt normal instead of suicidal. The instructors were pilots who'd survived 3 months of the real thing over France. Their lesson was simple: altitude kills you, speed saves you, and the P-47 can take damage that would atomize any other fighter. Trust the aircraft, master the altitude, and you might live long enough to go home.
March 29, 1944, the day the Luftwaffe learned that nowhere was safe anymore. Colonel Hubert Zemke had spent 7 months quietly perfecting the treetop tactic, rotating pilots through the hedge-hopping qualification course, studying intelligence reports on German airfield locations, and waiting for the right moment to unleash everything at once. That moment arrived with spring weather clearing over Normandy and intelligence confirming that Jagdgeschwader 2 and Jagdgeschwader 26, 2 of the Luftwaffe's elite fighter wings, were rotating squadrons through forward bases near Évreux and Bernay. The Germans thought these fields were safe, tucked 70 miles inland, protected by flak batteries and early warning networks. They were wrong. Zemke launched a coordinated strike involving 52 P-47s from 3 fighter groups, the 56th, 78th, and 353rd. No bombers to escort, no high-altitude sweep, just pure low-level hunting. The formation split up after crossing the French coast, dropping to 200 feet, then 100, thundering across the Norman countryside in 4-ship flights. French resistance spotters later reported they could feel the ground shake. The first flight hit Évreux at 07:46 hours. 18 Bf-109s were on the ground in various states of readiness, some taxiing, some still being fueled, several with pilots climbing aboard.
The P-47s materialized out of the morning haze, doing 370 miles per hour. The German gunners never got a shot off. In 85 seconds, 13 Bf-109s were burning hulks, and the Americans were gone, already racing toward their secondary targets. The beauty of the coordinated strike was the timing. The Luftwaffe's command structure depended on radio communication and centralized control. When Évreux got hit, they tried to warn other bases, but the Americans were already there. Bernay got hit 9 minutes after Évreux. Beaumont-le-Roger got hit 5 minutes after that. The Luftwaffe controllers were trying to vector fighters to intercept threats that had already attacked and vanished. It was like trying to swat flies with a sledgehammer while the flies were tearing your house apart. By 08:15 hours, P-47s had hit 8 different airfields across a 50-mile radius. The German pilots who did manage to get airborne found themselves trying to chase targets they couldn't see, flying at altitudes where one mistake meant disintegration. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, one of Zemke's original 3 guinea pigs from August, led a flight that caught a staffel of FW-190s at Conch Airfield during their morning briefing. The German pilots were standing beside their aircraft when Johnson's flight screamed over the boundary fence. Johnson's gun camera footage shows what happened next, and it's difficult to watch even 80 years later. FW-190s erupting in fireballs, pilots sprinting for cover, fuel trucks exploding and spreading fire across the flight line. Johnson's after-action report was clinical. Destroyed 5 aircraft on ground, probably destroyed 2 more. Heavy damage to fuel storage, no enemy fire encountered. Time over target, 9 seconds. 9 seconds that killed 3 years of Luftwaffe training and maintenance work.
The week-long March offensive, what American pilots started calling the Chattanooga choo-choo runs after they expanded to hitting trains, claimed 53 confirmed German aircraft destroyed on the ground, 27 locomotives destroyed, and countless trucks, fuel depots, and ammunition dumps turned into craters. The cost, 4 P-47s. 1 to flak, 1 to flying into a power line the pilot never saw, 1 to engine failure on the way home, 1 to unknown causes. The loss ratio was 13-1 in favor of the Americans. And suddenly, every Luftwaffe fighter commander in France was screaming for more flak guns, more camouflage, more anything that might stop the hedge-hopping Thunderbolts. The desperation in German radio intercepts was obvious. The hunters had become the hunted, and they had no idea how to fight back. Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, commander of the Luftwaffe's fighter forces, read the March loss reports and understood immediately that his air force was facing an existential threat. Losing aircraft in combat was one thing. You could replace planes, you could train new pilots. But losing them on the ground, along with the fuel trucks, ammunition, and ground crews, that was hemorrhage in capability faster than Germany's collapsing logistics network could replace. On April 2, 1944, Galland issued Directive 521 to all Jagdverband commanders in France. Relocate aircraft dispersal areas at least 1,000 meters from runways. Increase flak coverage on approach paths. Establish visual observer networks in villages surrounding every airfield. It was a tactical band-aid on an arterial bleed, and Galland knew it. The flak repositioning happened first because it was easiest. Luftwaffe ground forces dragged 37mm and 20mm automatic cannons away from airfield perimeters and placed them a kilometer out, hoping to catch the P-47s before they reached attack range. It didn't work. The Americans simply flew lower, using terrain folds and tree lines to mask their approach until they were inside the flak envelope. By the time the guns started tracking, the Thunderbolts had already fired and were screaming past at speeds the gunners couldn't match. Worse, positioning flak batteries in open fields made them targets. P-47 pilots started hunting the flak batteries themselves, strafing the positions with .50 caliber fire that turned the gun crews into casualties.
One German flak battery commander near Dreux reported losing 19 men in 4 weeks without scoring a single hit on an American fighter. The observer network was more effective, but created its own problems. The Luftwaffe recruited French civilians, some willing collaborators, some coerced, to watch roads and fields near airfields and telephone warnings when they heard aircraft engines. It gave the Germans maybe 40 extra seconds of warning, just enough time for pilots to sprint away from their aircraft, which meant they lived, but their planes still burned. The French resistance figured out the observer system within days and started feeding false reports, sending Luftwaffe personnel scrambling to their dispersal areas for ghost attacks while real P-47s hit different bases entirely. By mid-May, the observer network had become so polluted with misinformation that German commanders stopped trusting it. The dispersal tactic was the most desperate measure. Instead of parking aircraft in neat rows near the runway, efficient for maintenance and rapid launches, German ground crews started hiding individual fighters in tree groves, barns, and camouflage revetments scattered across the countryside. It saved aircraft from strafing runs, but it destroyed operational readiness. A Bf-109 hidden in a farmer's barn 3 kilometers from the runway needed 25 minutes to reach the flight line, get fueled, armed, and airborne. The whole point of a fighter base was rapid response. The Americans had forced the Luftwaffe to choose between protecting their aircraft and actually using them. They chose protection, which meant that even when German fighters survived, they weren't flying.
Living at 100 feet meant learning an entirely new language of survival that had nothing to do with the Luftwaffe. You could master every tactical principle, execute perfect gunnery, and still die because a flock of starlings exploded through your canopy at 360 miles per hour. Lieutenant James Goodson of the 4th Fighter Group learned this on April 17, 1944, when a bird strike shattered his windscreen over the Loire Valley. Blood and feathers and broken plexiglass in his face, half blind, wind tearing at his eyes at 320 miles per hour. Somehow he kept the stick steady and climbed out of the death zone. He landed at an emergency strip with glass shards embedded in his cheeks. The bird had been a crow. After that, pilots started calling them flying flak and developed an instinct for spotting bird behavior. If you saw them scatter, something was there. Trees, wires, other aircraft. The birds knew the terrain better than you did. Power lines were worse because you couldn't see them until you'd already hit them. France's rural electrical grid was a web of death strung between wooden poles at exactly the altitude American pilots were flying. The wires were thin, nearly invisible against the landscape, and tensioned strong enough to slice through aluminum like cheese wire. In March and April 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 11 P-47s to power line strikes. Not combat losses, not even counted as enemy action. Just administrative casualties that went into the statistics as struck obstacle during low-level flight. Lieutenant William O'Brien hit a line near Chartres that wrapped around his propeller and pulled down 4 telephone poles before it snapped. The jolt nearly ripped the engine off the airframe. He made it 12 miles before the vibrations forced him to bail out. Rescue crews found the P-47 with 50 feet of copper wires still tangled in the prop blades. The psychological pressure of hedge-hopping wasn't the fear of dying. Every combat pilot lived with that. It was the fear of dying stupidly. At altitude, if you got killed, it was combat, honorable. Someone would write your mother a letter about your bravery. At 100 feet, if you got killed, it was because you misjudged a hillside or didn't see the chimney or got distracted for half a second. Your wingman would report, "Flew into the ground," and everyone would know you'd made a mistake. That knowledge created a mental burden that some pilots couldn't carry. The 56 Fighter Group had 4 pilots in April 1944
who requested transfer to bomber escort duty, altitude missions, because they couldn't handle the ground-level stress anymore. One of them, a captain with 16 kills, told the flight surgeon he'd rather face the entire Luftwaffe at 22,000 feet than fly another mission at tree level. The surgeon approved the transfer without judgment because everyone understood. The physical toll was equally brutal. Flying at maximum speed for extended periods while constantly scanning terrain and threats created exhaustion that went beyond normal combat fatigue. Your body produced adrenaline continuously for 2 hours. Your eyes strained to track ground features rushing at you at 6 miles per minute. Your hands and arms fought constant micro-corrections to keep the aircraft stable at an altitude where a 3-degree mistake meant death. Pilots would land after a hedge-hopping mission and find their flight suits soaked through with sweat, despite flying in 45-degree weather. Some couldn't hold coffee cups steady for an hour after landing. The flight surgeons documented cases of pilots with hand tremors so severe they couldn't write their after-action reports and had to dictate them instead. Then there were the ones who adapted too well. The pilots who started taking unnecessary risks because they'd survived so many missions that they felt invincible. They'd fly at 50 feet instead of 100 feet. They'd strafe targets in broad daylight that should have been bypassed. The squadron commanders watched for this carefully because overconfidence at that altitude had a 100% mortality rate. It was just a question of when. Major Gerald Johnson grounded one of his best pilots for a week in April after the pilot flew under a railway bridge instead of over it. Not because he'd violated regulations, but because he'd stopped being afraid. At 100 feet, a healthy fear was the only thing keeping you alive. Lose that, and you became a statistic.
June 6, 1944, 0545 hours. Dawn was breaking over Normandy, and 156,000 Allied troops were hitting 5 invasion beaches in the largest amphibious assault in human history. The entire operation depended on one critical assumption, that the Luftwaffe wouldn't show up. Not couldn't show up, wouldn't. Because American fighters would make any German attempt to reach the beaches a suicide mission. General Eisenhower had bet the invasion on air supremacy, and the hedge-hopping P-47s were about to cash that check. Before the first landing craft touched sand, 267 Thunderbolts were already screaming across northern France at treetop level, hitting every Luftwaffe base within 180 miles of the coast. The strike started at 0500 hours, 105 minutes before H hour. The timing was surgical. Catch the Germans during their most vulnerable moment, right as they were preparing dawn patrols to investigate the invasion fleet that radar had been tracking all night. At Creil Airfield, 40 miles north of Paris, a group of Bf-109s was taxiing into takeoff position when 12 P-47s from the 78th Fighter Group materialized out of the pre-dawn gloom. The German pilots had their canopies open, checking instruments, completely focused on their pre-flight routine. They died without ever seeing what killed them. 21 Bf-109s destroyed in the time it takes to read this paragraph. At Beauvais, at Abbeville, at Amiens, the same scene repeated. German fighters burning before they could defend the beaches that were about to be lost. The hedge-hopping tactics evolved in real time that morning into something more sophisticated than simple strafing runs. Fighter groups coordinated continuous sweeps. As one flight finished its attack and pulled off target, another was already inbound from a different direction. The Germans never got a respite.
Radio intercepts captured Luftwaffe controllers screaming contradictory orders, trying to vector fighters to intercept threats coming from everywhere simultaneously. At 0635 hours, Jagdgeschwader 26 attempted to launch a Staffel from Lille-Venderville to attack the beaches. They got 5 aircraft airborne before P-47s hit the field. The 5 that launched were bounced by high-altitude P-51s waiting above the cloud layer. None reached the coast. The systematic destruction wasn't just about killing aircraft, it was about breaking the Luftwaffe's will to even try. By 0830 hours, as American troops were fighting through the surf at Omaha Beach, the Luftwaffe had managed to put exactly 3 aircraft over the invasion fleet, 3 reconnaissance planes that were shot down within minutes. Hitler reportedly spent the morning raging at his air commanders, demanding to know where the Luftwaffe was. The answer was simple: burning on airfields across France. The hedge-hoppers had flown 923 individual sorties that day, an operational tempo that should have been impossible. They didn't fly neat 8-hour missions with rest periods. They flew, landed, rearmed, refueled in 25 minutes, and launched again. Some pilots flew 5 sorties before sunset. The ground crews worked with such manic intensity that several collapsed from exhaustion. The daylight hours saw the P-47s expand beyond airfields to systematically destroying anything that moved toward Normandy. Trains, truck convoys, fuel depots, bridges. If it could support a German counterattack, it became a priority target. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski led a flight that caught a German panzer column attempting to move toward Caen. The tanks were buttoned up, crews inside, moving at road speed with no air cover. Gabreski's flight didn't have bombs, just 50 caliber API rounds, armor-piercing incendiary. They strafed the column from engine deck angles where the armor was thinnest. 4 Panzer IVs brewed up, their ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions. The column scattered into the tree line and didn't move again until after dark. Multiply that scene across 60 different roads, and you understand why German reinforcements that should have reached Normandy in 8 hours took 4 days. As the sun set on June 6th, the Luftwaffe had flown 287 sorties over Normandy. The Allies had flown 14,674. The difference was hedge-hopping. Every German aircraft that managed to survive the ground attacks faced a gauntlet of low-level American fighters between their base and the battlefield. The few that made it through accomplished nothing. The invasion succeeded because the sky over those beaches belonged entirely to the Allies, and the sky belonged to them because P-47 pilots had spent 8 months learning how to kill an air force before it could fly. D-Day wasn't just won on the beaches, it was won at 100 feet over France, one burning mess at a time.
The hedge-hopping revolution didn't end when the war did. It rewrote the manual on how air forces think about close air support and battlefield interdiction. By July 1944, every Allied air force in Europe had adopted some version of the treetop tactics. British Typhoons and Tempests started flying similar low-level strikes. Soviet I-18 Sturmovix, already designed for ground attack, refined their approach patterns based on American after-action reports. The Luftwaffe itself tried to copy the tactics in their few remaining operational sectors, but by then they lacked the fuel, the training time, and the aircraft to make it work. The P-47 hedge-hoppers had demonstrated something profound, that air superiority wasn't about controlling the sky above the battlefield. It was about controlling every inch of airspace from ground level upward.
You couldn't just win at altitude anymore. You had to dominate everywhere. The casualty statistics validated the entire approach, despite its brutal learning curve. Between March and August 1944, P-47 groups flying hedge-hopping missions destroyed 1,967 German aircraft on the ground, 341 locomotives, over 10,000 trucks and armored vehicles, and hundreds of bridges and fuel depots. They lost 317 aircraft in the same period, 128 to flak, 94 to ground obstacles and mechanical failure during low-level flight, 73 to enemy fighters, and 22 to unknown causes. A loss rate of roughly 16% over 6 months of the most intense combat operations in aviation history. Brutal numbers, but sustainable. More importantly, the aircraft they destroyed on the ground never killed Allied bombers, never strafed Allied troops, never contested the skies over France. The mathematics of attrition favored the side that could replace losses. And by mid-1944, that was definitely not Germany. The Korean War saw American pilots applying hedge-hopping principles against North Korean and Chinese forces with devastating effect. F-18 and F-84 jets screamed across the Korean countryside at tree level, hitting supply columns and airfields using tactics refined over France a decade earlier. The speeds were higher, jets versus props, but the fundamental approach remained identical. Fly low, fly fast, exploit terrain, hit targets before they know you're there. Vietnam later learned these lessons the hardest way possible when American F-4 Phantoms and A-7 Corsairs flew low-level interdiction missions along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The terminology changed. Nap of the earth flying replaced hedge-hopping, but the DNA was pure 1944 Thunderbolt tactics. Modern close air support doctrine still carries the fingerprints of those P-47 pilots. The A-10 Warthog, designed in the 1970s specifically for low-altitude ground attack, incorporated every lesson learned over France. Heavy armor protection underneath, redundant flight systems, weapons optimized for ground targets, and training that emphasizes terrain masking and high-speed approaches. Air Force survival schools still teach the tactical principles that Hub Zemke's pilots discovered through trial and error, that altitude gives you visibility, but ground level gives you surprise, that speed at low altitude is better protection than maneuverability at high altitude, and that the ground is a weapon if you know how to use it. The specific aircraft changed, the weapons got more sophisticated, but the core concept of using terrain and speed to achieve tactical surprise remained gospel. The psychological legacy might be even more important than the tactical one. The hedge-hopping campaign proved that conventional wisdom could be wrong, that doctrine written in peacetime might need to be thrown out when people start dying, and that sometimes the right answer is the one that sounds completely insane. Hub Zemke got court-martialed exactly never for his unauthorized tactical experiments. Instead, he got the Distinguished Service Cross. The Army Air Forces, and later the Independent Air Force, internalized a cultural lesson about innovation under fire. When faced with unacceptable losses, you don't keep doing the same thing harder. You question everything. You test alternatives, and you empower junior officers to experiment. That institutional flexibility became part of American air power doctrine. Walk through the Air Force Museum in Dayton today, and you'll find a P-47 Thunderbolt suspended from the ceiling. The placard talks about high-altitude bomber escort and the massive radial engine. It's historically accurate, but incomplete. The real story of the Thunderbolt is that it became most dangerous when it flew lowest, when pilots pointed that massive nose at the ground instead of the sky, when it became a hedge-hopping predator that taught an entire generation how to fight at the altitude where physics and surprise mattered more than altitude advantage. 8 months, 100 feet,
and a willingness to ignore every rule. That's how American pilots caught the Luftwaffe off guard and helped win the air war over Europe.